1330 WBTM, and we're talking with Karen Hall, who's originally from Chatham but has been a writer and producer in Hollywood for years. And Karen, I appreciate you taking time to share with us this morning your experience at the memorial service and the time that you spent with the Fords. And I noticed from the very interesting and very nice pictures of the memorial service, it was very limited access, particularly for a former president's wife, a first lady. And obviously the people who were there were people who they had decided ahead of time were very important to them. And you spent time with the Fords as you were writing the script for the Betty Ford story. And I was thinking, when you're writing a script about somebody's life, that can be very intimate and personal. So I imagine you had some moments with them that the rest of us have never had.
I definitely did. And, I was just very fond of her from the first moment. The first thing she said to me, because, I grew up in Chatham, Virginia, 1,200 people. And when I was growing up, my father and my mother used to always just harp on us about table manners. And when my father would go on conventions, they would make my sister and I call the restaurant at the hotel and make a reservation and go by ourselves when we were tiny, like elementary school. And my father used to always say, you never know, someday you might be sitting down to eat with a president. And he wanted us to know how to do that.
And didn't realize how prophetic he was.
I know. And when I was sitting there waiting to meet her, that's all I could think about. Because of the way I was raised, I felt perfectly suited to it. I felt like I knew what to do. I was still nervous about just the initial meeting, and so her secretary had made me sit down in the living room and went to get her. And so I was just sitting there debating, what's the first thing you say to the first lady? And she came into the room, and before she introduced herself or said, nice to meet you, the first thing she said was, I have finally found some iced tea glasses that will fit in the top shelf of the dishwasher.
What a way to break the ice.
She did, but it wasn't really intentional. It's just that's who she is.
And that's one of the reasons people admired, and I certainly did, the Fords, because they seemed like ordinary people who had just excelled because of their abilities. And, he came from a sort of a blue-collar district there when he was elected to Congress. And when you were interacting with them and working with her on the script to the Betty Ford story, were there other times when you saw an ordinariness in a very nice way, not only with you but with each other?
Yes. I met her in Palm Springs at that house, and they had another house in Vail, Colorado, where they spent the summers. And so I had gone to Vail after I had met her in Palm Springs just to spend a few days, listening to her talk and getting everything I needed just to start the script. So I'd gone down there, I booked a hotel, and I was getting over a cold or something. I was not feeling well. And the hotel had put me in a room that was right over the swimming pool where a party was going on. And I just wanted desperately to get some sleep so that I would have a brain the next day.
Mm-hmm.
So I called her to let her know I was in town, and it was very loud in my room, and I was apologizing for that. And she told me to leave the hotel and come stay at her house.
How nice.
That's what I did, and that was amazing.
Because when you're with somebody in their home all day and night, you see them interact with each other in a way that can be a revelation.
Yes. And, it really was a confirmation, because what I most felt about them was that they are just completely unpretentious. And, it's true. If you stay at their house for 4 days, there's only so long a person can keep up a front. But they were just, they're just normal people.
And you had mentioned earlier a wonderful story about having dinner with them, and the president was relating a story about something pretty spectacular.
He was talking about his trip to China,
mm-hmm.
And I don't remember the specific story, but to me it was just amazing to be able to listen to that, because, I'm from Chatham, Virginia, and the former president's telling me about his trip to China.
Mm-hmm.
And in the middle of that, Mrs. Ford interrupted him to ask me if my cherries were okay. We had cherries for dessert.
So it sounds like she was very respectful of him, but not overwhelmed, which is probably the kind of partner a man of his accomplishments would need.
Right. And, and she was determined that she was going to be a hostess, even if she had to break into his long-winded story.
Yes, these international relation flashbacks and in public. And when she wrote her autobiography, For people who are younger and not that familiar with her, what was it in that autobiography that you folks said, this has got to be a movie, you write the script for it? Give us some of the highlights of her life and some of the ways that she really showed courage and was ahead of her time in ways she knew would not be popular back then.
For a first lady to announce that she had breast cancer was a big thing at the time.
Yes, because that was not discussed at the time. It was considered intimate and something you discuss very much in private.
It was intimate, and if you said cancer, you whispered it.
Yes. But do you agree that by discussing that in public, she was able to help other people be at ease with it and develop support systems if they have it, and maybe save lives by people getting it on their radar and getting early checks and things like that?
Absolutely, and I know that that's why she did it, because she wasn't really a person who wanted to broadcast all of her private secrets, but she understood when she was First Lady that she was in a position to be able to help a great number of people if she was willing to do that. And I think that's why she decided to do it with breast cancer and with the alcohol and prescription drug addiction.
And see, that was a magnitude above even breast cancer as a subject that was intimate and private that you didn't discuss. And yet when you look at the fruit of her coming out, as it were, and discussing that, even though she knew she'd be scorned by a lot of people, now, almost a generation later, you have the Betty Ford Clinic, you have people who owe their lives to her, and she never even thought that would be a result. She was just getting the ball rolling.
I think she wouldn't have thought of the magnitude of the result, but I'm sure she did it because of this, just like breast cancer. I'm sure she thought back to that and knew that she could accomplish something, because it would have been very easy for her to check into the Long Beach Naval Hospital and go through rehab without the rest of the world ever having known anything about it.
As a lot of people would have and did, and you can't fault them for that.
No, you can't, and I think she ultimately was very glad that she did what she did. But even though, she had such a great influence, and I think she understood the magnitude of what she had accomplished, but she was just still very grounded and centered about it. She did not have a huge ego.
And so with that relationship and with the regard you had for her, I imagine it was quite an honor for you to be invited to her memorial service.
It was. It's funny because there was a very limited guest list. That might be because there was going to be another funeral in Grand Rapids. Mm-hmm. But when I first got the invitation, I was surprised because I had, our contact had become pretty much limited to Christmas cards. And then I later learned that Mrs. Ford had basically produced the memorial service herself. She told everybody exactly what she wanted. So I'm sure she made the guest list, and that's why I was on it.
As you looked around and people interacted, as they always do before a funeral starts, and sometimes it's even almost a lighthearted, appreciative atmosphere, what'd you see?
Well, a lot of the people were members of the church, so a lot of the people knew each other. I was surprised because when I gave my ticket to the usher, we all had assigned sections, and I thought I'd be in the balcony or the way back, and that would have been fine with me. And they took me way down front, and I ended up on a side section. The church has an altar and then sections on each side and then the regular section. So I ended up on the side section in the second row, and the pews were angled toward each other, so the pew directly across from me had all the political dignitaries. So I just spent all of the time after they came in, I spent that time looking at their interactions, which was fascinating to me. George Bush brought Nancy Reagan in, and she had insisted on walking instead of having a wheelchair, so it took them a while to get down the aisle. And then not long after that, Hillary Clinton, the First Lady, and Rosalind Carter came in, and they all got situated in the pews, and Hillary Clinton sat next to George Bush, and they talked and laughed and like old friends before the service started.
That would probably surprise a lot of people, but behind the scenes, I think more of that goes on because they have the respect for each other than we would imagine.
That's it, and that's why when Cokie Roberts gave her eulogy, mm-hmm. she said that Mrs. Ford had instructed her to talk about what politics was like when they were growing up as congressional brats, or Cokie was, and how the people would fight with each other all day, but then they'd go out to dinner at night. And they all had respect for each other, and they understood the position, and it wasn't the Hatfields and McCoys. And Cokie Roberts said she halfway thought that Betty Ford had chosen this week to die in particular to remind everybody to just get along.
That's interesting. And something else I find ironic, and you can explain this a bit. Since Jimmy Carter beat Gerald Ford in the presidential election, some people would wonder why Rosalind was selected as one of the three eulogists.
Yes, and she talked about that, and she said that she had met when Jimmy Carter was governor, and Mrs. Ford had gone down to Georgia, just hit it off, and they were friends ever since. And she said that at the time that she was entertaining Betty Ford at the Georgia governor's mansion, that she knew in the back of her mind and didn't want to say to her that her husband was getting ready to run against President Ford. But they remained friends anyway, and they were actually very close friends.
And that's almost a parallel to you talking about Hillary Clinton and W talking there. A lot of these people do have respect away from the television cameras.
Yes. I think President Bush became friends with Bill Clinton while his father and Bill Clinton were working on
that fundraising?
Their fundraising.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's why he knows Hillary Clinton well. But it was really, I found it almost, I'm personally really tired of, everyone hating each other. So I found it really calming to watch the two of them talk and laugh. And I thought it's impossible to dislike these people when you're in a room with them.
And maybe they find that out when they're in a room and politics is not the subject.
Yes. And I had thought, and I still think, that the Fords were very special in their lack of pretentiousness. But you just remember that these are really just people. They have strengths and weaknesses and insecurities and everything that we have.
Yes. On television, they are debating and running for something, but in a room, they are just people. And I guess it personalizes them to see them in particularly a situation like a funeral that tends to humble and level everybody.
Yes. And I did notice about all of them. None of them acted like they were anyone special. I really loved to stand there and say the Lord's Prayer, sitting directly across from George Bush. It's a very weird and wonderful experience.
Yes, that kind of thing will touch your spirit even beyond your emotions.
Yes, and all of us saying the Apostles' Creed together, it was just very, very much a sense of everybody in the room was the same. And I felt really honored and lucky to be able to see that.
Well, Karen, I appreciate you taking us behind the curtain in their lives and also sharing the obviously very dramatic feeling of the memorial service there. And I appreciate you taking the time and giving us an insight into somebody that we all admired from a distance, but now with your help, we feel like we know them a little better. It's too bad that they're gone. I think that if more politics were conducted the way they conducted it, you're right, we wouldn't see the acrimony that we see now.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Karen.
Thank you.